All right, well, welcome everyone to Tea and Tales. Our theme this year is transportation, and so far we've told you about life after the railway. We talked about the gold rush, and last week Eric Anderson told us a pretty compelling story about the importance of how sound as a transportation and shipping corridor as well as a tourism corridor. The topic this week is roads and taxes, also known as 12 bridges and miles of muck, which I'll get into later. But as part of the research that we did for the transportation exhibit, one of the topics was early roads and how did they come to be and how did people build them and where did the money come from. So this tale today is based on that research. Pemberton residents, it turns out, have been paying taxes for road improvements since 1903. And that's happened through taxes, fees, and levies, things like licensing fees and property taxes and gasoline levies. The coming of the railways saw an improvement in the local road system, and as early as 1903, people started to make improvements to the road system. Early road foremen, though, were really challenged to build roads in this area, and they were on very tight budgets, so they had to demonstrate a lot of creativity in their engineering solutions, and we'll talk about a couple of those early road foremen. And in the 1930s, the Board of Trade began a lobbying effort to improve local road conditions. And this is when the topic of extending the road to the south really started to come up for people, because they were paying the same taxes as people in the lower mainland, but they couldn't drive out of Pemberton. And Bob Taylor, who owned and operated the Pemberton Express from 1919 to 1958, was one of those people that helped with those early lobbying efforts. Today, local residents continue to lobby for road improvements in the district, and the recent 2013 case that went to the Supreme Court of BC regarding Highline Road and its status as a road is an example of those lobbying efforts that still go on today. This is a picture of the Upper Valley Road in the 1920s and some of the traffic congestion you would have found up there. In 1903, $325 were spent, but an official soon reported that there is nothing there at present worthy of the name road. Local residents referred to the road as the trail and often chose to paddle to town in dugout canoes. In the winter, snow often plugged the trail, and the twisting track was so narrow until 1906 that no settler beyond the rock slide on the Ryan River owned a wagon or a mower. Today are some of these early road improvements from the turn of the century through to about the 1950s. We're going to tell you a little bit about Bob Taylor and some of the Pemberton Express adventures Bob had running that business. We're going to tell you about the Pemberton Dust Committee in the 1960s, and we're going to tell you about the Highline Road case that was launched in 2011 and was resolved at the Supreme Court level in 2013. We're going to highlight the leaning grader, which is a piece of equipment we have in the front park, and I'll tell you a little bit of what I found out about roads and taxes today. So in 1903, construction began. Now you can see this is some pretty rough construction. These are men with shovels and you have horses. So in 1906, the Lillooet district, because remember the center of government at the turn of the century was Lillooet, they provided residents with the use of a grader, 2 spreading wagons, 1 horse roller, 1 engine, and a sawmill to improve roadworks in the district. Essentially the Lillooet district said, here's some equipment, good luck. And Pemberton carried on. In 1909, 16 years after the road was begun, settlers circulated a petition and asked that the road up the valley be put in a condition for wagon traffic. Residents really needed to get wagons up the valley. This resulted in the hiring of the first local road foreman, Robert Hutchinson. And the first big change was the diversion of the road from the banks of the Rhine River to its current route through the Miller property. And this was to avoid this area called the Rock Slide. The large project provided work for local men and work camps were established. So it was a significant project in the day with tax dollars being spent. So Robert Hutchinson was the road foreman for a year, and then he was followed by James Punch. And I searched our archive. I couldn't find an actual image of James Punch, but I did find an image of the Punch house and Mrs. Punch and some children and a dog. Anyway, he became the foreman in 1910, and he built the bridge over the Lillooet River with Douglas Addy. The approach in two spans measured 186 feet and cost $1,876. A few years later, the bridge was painted red and became known as the Red Bridge, and it crossed the Lillooet River at the end of Pemberton Farm Road East, which is just up over here, down towards the Lillooet River Lodge. That's where the original bridge went across. The Red Bridge group in 1916, 1917, you have Violet Harris, Lena Harris, Una Harris, and Edith Harris. And the youngster is Verna Thompson. So they're out and about on the Red Bridge there. And in 1914, the road was finally continued from the Red Bridge to Mount Currie, and it followed the north bank of the Lillooet River. So before 1914, the only way for residents from Mount Currie and beyond the Birkin area, their only way to travel to Pemberton was at low water along the south bank of the river. So it greatly improved transportation between all those. Here's a photograph of the first car brought into the area. This was brought in 1914 by Foley, Welch, and Stewart, who were the principals of the Pacific Great Eastern. And you can see them there in their trench coats, though you can't really see their faces very clearly. They brought this car over the lakes on a barge, and it's a 1914 McLaughlin Buick. What happened in 1914 is with the arrival of the railroad, there was pressure to improve access to the railway station. So some of the first tax dollars were spent on just graveling around the station in the downtown area. In 1914, the PGE obliterated sections of the old Portage Trail and laid ties and steel on the nice level stretches. Up to 1916, men continued to repair both the Anderson and Seton Lake trails. As we talked about last week during the gold rush, there were well-established trails along Anderson and Seton. Traffic didn't just go by sternwheeler. There were also people who couldn't afford a trip on the boat, so there was quite an established trail system along the lakes. So there was some tax dollars spent on those trails in 1916. Here's an image of a group from the Portage Road. We're not sure, but we think they're on their way to Anderson Lake. The woman in the tam is Adela, Mrs. Sandy Fowler. The girl to the right is Kay Ruddock, and near the boat's bow, or near the trucks, and the Fraser girl in front of her is Tommy and Edith Fowler. Until 1913, annual monies provided for the Portage Road were a few $100s. By 1913, however, this increased to $2,800. However, the Upper Valley Road was allocated $7,250. In 1920, the foreman Ollis Lee was hired. This is an image we found that was donated by the Fowler family. It's titled A Government Road Truck. We're not sure, but we're thinking it's from the 1930s. I couldn't find an image of Ollis Lee, but he'd been in the valley already since the turn of the century. He was a World War I vet. He arrived in Pemberton in 1912 with Jake Locken and left with Locken to enlist, and when he returned, he married Helen Dermody. The public works foreman always budgeted twice the amount Ollis quoted for a bridge, not believing he could do the work so cheaply. The result was that Lee built his bridges, but he also had enough money left over then to put an approach on each side. And this is how most of the original muddy roads turned into good roads. This is a picture, again, of a Harris girl, Vera Harris, on the Miller Creek Bridge in 1915. Now, I found a first-person story that was written by Ben Cherry. Ben Cherry was hired by Ollis Lee, and he was still alive when they were writing the history book, so he was able to talk about Ollis and some of the contributions Ollis had made. He says that Ollis was a practical man who had been an engineer in the First World War. And when the public works engineer would come from Vancouver to get his spring estimates, Lee would say, well, there should be a bridge here, or whatever it might be. The engineer would say, okay, how much money do you want? Well, Ollis would say, I can build that bridge for $500. And the engineer would say, you can't build a bridge for $500. We'll put in for $1,500. The result was that Lee built his bridges for $500, but he also put a long approach on each side. And usually these approaches were up to 2 miles in length. So this is how the roads were improved. The early period of building these roads, Ben Cherry also told us that the public works foremen were very concerned with river control in those days. This is long before there was a diking district. So Ben also talks about river control, and he says public works did a lot of riverbank protection. They had one lung Fairbanks engine, and I suppose it was 12 or 16 horsepower. In the present 12 miles of drainage area using that engine, the road crews must have driven hundreds of piles. Some of these piles formed piers going out into the river to try to direct into its old channel, and some protected the banks. Then I suppose thousands of tons of brush and rock were dumped behind the piles lining the Lillooet all the way up the valley. The protection work was mostly on the west side, of course, because the men were trying to force the river back against the mountains on the east. A little bit after Ollis Lee, Sandy Fowler became the public works foreman, and he served until 1948, so a lot of the modern road system we can thank Sandy Fowler for. In the 1930s, local residents started to lobby for more road maintenance and equipment for road improvements. They were disgusted that they had to pay license fees on December 1st of each year when the roads were typically impassable. They were stuck at home. Here's some photographs from the 1920s through to the 1950s. At the top, we've got the caption on the back of this photograph reads, Francis, Joe and Co. in his flivver. And it's got a date of June 1923. And then we have 1920, Pemberton Meadows, with W.C. Green's car. Standing is W.C. Green, and the small boy is Dick Green. And then I love this photo with the motorcycle. This is Marjorie Olesko and Leon Keys at the Pemberton station in 1937. And then we have the Meadows Road, 1953, and this is a Joe Antonelli photo. He sent us a few great photos of muddy roads, and this is approximately across from where Kiora Trailer Park is today. So until the 50s, little improvement occurred on the road between Egerton and Pemberton Station. In 1939, the Board of Trade requested immediate course of action on that section of road described as being constantly underwater. When it was flooded, cars proceeded very slowly throughout that stretch. School children and other walkers removed their shoes and rolled up their pants. At a 1937 meeting, residents prophetically expressed resentment at what they considered unfair diversion of district road funds to the Bridge River communities. During the last 3 or 4 years, necessary road maintenance has been sacrificed in favor of the other areas in the district. Pemberton, this community, will be growing in paying taxes when the mining areas are dead. So there was quite a lobbying effort that the Board of Trade started in the 30s. This is a great image that we got last year from Warner and Audrey Oberson. So Warner took this photograph out of a freight train, and you can see the Hydro Tote Road in 1956. I'm not exactly sure where this is, but we're hoping to get more images of this original tote road that turned into Highway 99. So lack of transportation kept Pemberton from the mainstream of provincial life in the 1940s and the 50s. There was 75 miles of roadway within Pemberton Valley and District, but nobody could get out. And for those few miles, people paid the same insurance rates as people in the Lower Mainland. In the early 1950s, Graveling and ditching of the Valley Road had started bit by bit, and Bob Taylor and family with Pemberton Express and some of their adventures. He operated the Express from 1919 to 1958. The Pemberton Express was a Ford Model T, and as Taylor explained, it was a multi-purpose vehicle. It was an ambulance, it was a hearse, and it was a general transportation business. He describes his early driving experiences. And this quote is quite lengthy, but I'm just going to read you a short part of it. He says, 12 bridges to navigate, 1 mile of corduroy, and one lengthy bridge about 300 feet that had a habit of moving up and down or leaning sideways, depending on frost heave in winter and high water in summer. The road itself was about 10 feet wide. In those days, the PGE trains arrived at 2 a.m., so there was not much choice about night trips. He suggests that you imagine yourself 10 miles from Pemberton in the dark, the temperature below zero, in this vehicle with a flat tire. The people in the photo, you've got Bob Taylor at the wheel, and his mother's in the back seat, and she was known as Granny Taylor. And seated behind her is one of 2 Gardner brothers, Harry and William. We're not sure who's who. And the second stands in the doorway, and their mother sits beside Mrs. Taylor. So this image shows the Vancouver Board of Trade. These are some members that were here on a visit. They're all wearing engineer hats, so I'm thinking this has something to do with the arrival of the train from North Vancouver in 1956. And the view from this photo is looking south, and it was taken near the Leonard McNulty farm. When Squamish celebrated its road link to Vancouver in 1958, this is the lengths the Board of Trade went to. The Board of Trade planned to take a Jeep caravan over BC Electric's Tote Road and various logging roads to join the ceremonies in Squamish. To basically say that we got here and we think the road should go a little further north than Squamish. And they made it to Squamish in spite of forest fires and woods closures. The opening of Whistler, though, as a ski resort in 1966 was really what provided the pressure on the province to extend the road 25 miles to the north, and by 1964 it was declared open, though only for the adventurous. So on August 18th, our last tale is about those early years of that hydro tote road and the beginning of Highway 99, and we'll be talking about that on August 18th at our last tea. I couldn't tell you this story without talking to you about the Pemberton Dust Committee. And there was a woman I met many years ago. Her name was Betty Connell, and she'd been a school trustee for a long time. She was the woman that really spearheaded this effort. She had a son who had asthma and had a lot of concerns about the dust that was being created. So in the 60s, heavy logging trucks, like the one shown there, were damaging the Upper Valley Road. And clouds of dust thrown up by the vehicles meant having to stop and wait for the dust to clear. And you had school buses going up the road, and it was quite busy. I remember Hugh Naylor mentioned in the 70s, he did a count, and there were 100 trucks a day coming through town. So residents in the 1980s formed the Pemberton Valley Dust Committee and successfully lobbied the province for the paving of the Meadows Road. In more recent times, local residents challenged the government's lack of funding for maintenance on the Highline Road. That's a Forest Service road that travels from Darcy to Seaton. The claim, initiated by Wolfgang Skutnik, claimed that this route was a road by definition of Section 42 in the Transportation Act. He claimed that because taxes were collected for its construction and maintenance over the last century, the province needed to take responsibility for its continued maintenance. His claim was successful. In 2013, the BC Supreme Court declared that the Douglas Trail Road between Darcy and Seaton, commonly known as the Highline Road, is a provincial highway. Now, I've driven it recently, and I don't know that it's quite met that status yet. But in her decision on February 7th, 2013, Justice Laurel D. Russell determined that the provincial government had previously spent money to maintain the road, and therefore it should carry highway status. The ruling means that the province will be responsible for maintaining the 24-kilometer stretch of road and bringing it up to a provincial standard. You can look up details of this case online. This is what I found. It's a Whistler Question website. Out in front of the museum, we have a leaning grader. And this was on permanent loan, given to the museum on permanent loan from the Ministry of Transportation. They're a Crown corporation, so they actually can't give away any assets, but they did sign a form saying that we could have it out front there forever. This grader was a horse-drawn leaning grader built by J.D. Adams and Company. Adams invented the leaning wheel grader in the late 1800s due to the difficulty of working on the sloping side of a road. The blade is set at a fixed angle with leaning wheels, and this principle has been a key feature of graders through to modern times. We're not sure if this was used in Pemberton. It has the Osman Cat, which is in between the Sam Jim and the gift shop. And that piece of equipment was used to build dikes as well as logging roads in the area. So what I have for you now is what the province is doing about roads today. It gave me a few concerns for Pemberton. So what I found out is that the total length of paved roads in BC is 23,000 kilometers. In 2014, Ministry of Transportation budget stated that since 2005, 22 billion has been committed to improve and expand port, rail, road, and airport facilities. From 2010 to 2012, there was targeted 25 billion on Pacific Gateway projects. And the road improvements mentioned are all in the Lower Mainland, Alberta connectors, Highway 97, Vancouver Island, and Northern BC. In 2011-2012, the province spent a total of 690 million. In 2012-2013, they spent 638 million. And in 2013-2014, they were going to reduce spending to 560 million on highways, highway roads. This is because they're going to spend more money on the completion of the many Gateway Program highway projects in Metro Vancouver, such as the South Fraser Perimeter Road, and this doesn't include the Port Mann Highway 1 project. A little bit more that I've found out is that generally infrastructure funding has been volatile for the past 10 years. This is across Canada. Relative to the United States, the share of provincial expenditure on transportation in BC as a percentage of GDP is very low. We're spending 1.5%. Federal transfers for roadway expenditures in BC have also been going down, and this is a story you can track across Canada, that the federal government is putting the responsibility to the provinces for roads. And on CBC's website, there was an article about the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, who were raising concerns about the level of taxes on gasoline and diesel fuels in BC, saying drivers in Vancouver now pay the second highest taxes on fuel after Montreal. And consumers in Canada actually pay GST on the taxes they pay for fuel. In BC, the sales tax is calculated after the motor fuel tax, carbon tax, and federal excise tax are added to the price of the fuel. Those three taxes total 42 cents tax per litre in Greater Vancouver, 34 cents in Victoria, and 31 cents across the rest of BC, and this is before GST is added on. The result has been governments are collecting an extra 1.6 billion from unsuspecting motorists. And he also took aim at tax schemes designed to fund transit projects, citing Vancouver as an example that residents of other cities should worry about.
Oh, maybe not anymore.
He goes on to say in Vancouver, working families pay $551 extra no matter how much money they earn. And the further they need to drive to get to work or their kids to soccer games, the bigger the tax grab. It's not a fair way to push for multi-billion-dollar transit projects. So Area C has a population that includes First Nations of about 3,500. And the size of Area C is 5,500 square kilometers. I looked into whose responsibility roads were in Area C, and the Local Government Act explains that municipalities possess local public roads, and that's in the community charter. Other roads in unincorporated areas and provincial highways within municipalities are the responsibility of the Transportation Ministry. So in Pemberton, the village would be responsible for all of the residential streets, but the main Meadows Road coming through town here, the main strip would be provincial jurisdiction. Regional districts are not empowered to possess public roads. And a form of regional road system governance was introduced in 1998 when TransLink was established and empowered to designate a Greater Vancouver regional road network, set regional road standards, and finance major road development. The municipalities continue to own the roads, and general plans for major municipal roads must be included in official community plans to the extent that these are regional matters. And regional growth strategies must include transportation plans. So in this area, the SLRD would have a regional growth strategy, and that will include a transportation plan for Area C, but they don't have any jurisdiction over road improvements. So history teaches us that local road improvements always has required lobbying by local residents to compel the provincial government to invest in the area because it's a very small population. Road foremen in the past, like today, had to be innovative to solve local road issues on small budgets. The population in the Lower Mainland is set to increase by 1 million people in the next decade. So the Lower Mainland's transportation challenges will continue to impact how many provincial dollars are spent in this area on road improvements. And an example of the Highline Road can take many years to resolve. And the residents involved in that fight were quite weary with it by the time it hit the Supreme Court of BC. Rural areas like Pemberton, Mount Currie, and Darcy will have to continue lobbying efforts to ensure local roads are not left behind as the Ministry of Transportation focuses on the Pacific Gateway project through to 2020. Early settlers would tell us that road improvements and whether they happen or not is up to us. So that's my tale for you about roads and taxes.
Very good.